Thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar. I'd like to thank the funders of Cochrane Canada, without whom these webinars, our training, systematic reviews, and capacity building could not happen. A big thank you as well to CIHR for their support. I'd also like to thank Tahoe for kindly providing the software for our webinars, and a special thank you to Louis Gabriel Cuervo, who produces videos of our webinars. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's webinar on systematic reviews of preclinical animal research. Who are the potential knowledge users? Today we'll be hearing from Marc Avey. Dr. Avey completed his PhD at the University of Alberta, where he studied the neuromechanisms of auditory perception in songbirds. He completed a fellowship in animal science policy at the Canadian Council on Animal Care before joining the clinical epidemiology program at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute as a CIHR postdoctoral fellow. Marc, please go ahead.
All right, hello everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, as you just said, in Ottawa. And this is actually my first webinar, so I'm going to try and remember to speak slowly and move through the material. And at the end, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to elaborate on anything that I can help you out with. So just to start, I just have to figure out how to switch slide. There you go. Systematic reviews of preclinical animal research. Who are the potential knowledge users? So as a KT fellow, one of the important things that I work on is thinking about how it is that we take what we learn from our research and we move that into practice. And since I work in a clinical epidemiology program, that's often the background is thinking about how do we take clinical trial information or information that we gleaned with working with humans, and how do we take that into the clinic with the primary care physicians? How do we move that knowledge from the research world into the practice at the hospitals? Now, in preclinical, we're actually moving a step backwards with the research to a step before we work with humans, except that now we got to rethink maybe who are the actual knowledge users, who are the people who are going to use this information, and how do we get that information to those people. So today's talk is really sort of trying to rethink the same idea of who are knowledge users and knowledge translation, but moving a step back into the preclinical and looking at how to move forward into early phase clinical. One way to sort of think about this is to look at Cochrane and the systematic reviews they produce, and sort of ask who uses your knowledge. And this is just a screenshot taken a few days ago of the top 50 reviews. This is just showing the top 10 reviews from the past 3 months that have been accessed from the Cochrane Library. And you can see that I've highlighted in red here with the red box around it this one review, cranberries for preventing urinary tract infections. So my question is, who do you think is interested in cranberries and UTIs the most? Policymakers, decision makers, researchers from different disciplines, the public, industry, clinicians, or the media? I'm seeing a lot of E's up here. Okay, there's a lot of non-guesses and a few people who use the poll said E, and this is probably right. It's actually really difficult to get this sort of information. Who's actually accessing reviews when you look online? But the common sense sort of tells us that most likely the end user for this, who's accessing the abstract for this review, is actually the general public. It's not researchers, not policymakers aren't the number one people accessing this. So this makes us really sort of highlights that you can produce a systematic review but the people who are actually going to use that systematic review might not be your fellow colleagues who are doing research in systematic review. So it highlights the importance of thinking about who are the actual users. So today I'm going to cover very briefly and at a very sort of mile-high level or 10-mile-high level for knowledge users, what is it that should be being transferred and to whom should the knowledge be transferred? So who are the potential knowledge users for preclinical? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the knowledge management system, and I'm really going to talk about knowledge translation and trying to rethink where do preclinical systematic reviews fit from the bench to bedside sort of models that we look at for knowledge translation. So to start, Grimshaw and colleagues had a paper come out in 2012 where they covered the knowledge translation of research findings, and they asked 5 questions. And the first 2 questions that I'm going to look at are really just the first 2 questions out of these 5, and that's, as I said, what should be transferred and to whom should research knowledge be transferred. I'm not going to cover the other questions, by whom should the research knowledge be transferred, and importantly, how should the research knowledge be transferred, and with what effect should research knowledge be transferred. But all these questions are important to think about when we think about knowledge users. We need to think about all of these questions, even though I'm not going to cover them all today. So what should be transferred? Grimshaw and colleagues suggest that the basic unit of knowledge translation should usually be up-to-date systematic reviews or other syntheses of research findings. And I'm going to agree with that, the basic unit of knowledge should be systematic reviews, certainly or potentially other syntheses of research findings. It shouldn't be the primary studies that we should be aiming to transfer as a general rule. So when you think about systematic reviews and where they fit, you often see, especially if you saw the first webinar in this series by Dr. Linars, you'll see pyramids set up of sort of knowledge pyramids, and often systematic reviews are placed at the top of the pyramid, and then maybe randomized controlled trials are a step down, and you move down to different primary studies, down to expert opinion usually at the bottom. But when we move and we start thinking about knowledge translation, systematic reviews aren't necessarily at the top of the pyramid. And in this case, this one that I'm going to go through, the 6S model, they're somewhere in the middle. And so if we start at the bottom, there's your primary studies at the bottom. These are the original articles, maybe RCTs and maybe cohort studies, whatever they are. And then there's synopses of studies. These would be examples of evidence-based abstract journals. And then there's systematic reviews, and obviously the Cochrane Library is an excellent example of that in the middle. But as you move from systematic reviews into practice, and certainly in the clinical field, primary care physicians aren't necessarily accessing systematic reviews. They may be accessing synopses of syntheses, for instance, healthevidence.ca, or they may be accessing summaries. So for instance, you would be hoping that a clinical practice guideline will reference systematic reviews, but the practitioners won't be actually going and getting the systematic reviews. What they'll be looking at is the clinical practice guideline. So the actual information that's being translated is being translated in the clinical practice guideline, but it's based off of the basic unit of knowledge, is that we want that based off of systematic reviews, not individual studies. So thinking about how preclinical evidence sort of fits into this model, it's good to go back and think about evidence-based medicine and where it fits in. And the Venn diagram is a nice simplification. And I think preclinical evidence sort of maybe intuitively fits into the best external evidence. As you can see on the right there, it's not part of individual clinical expertise or the patient choices, values, or expectations. Preclinical evidence is part of the external evidence base that we're thinking about for clinical. And you can look at, for instance, Sackett and colleagues when they describe what evidence-based medicine is. It's the best available external clinical evidence, and then we mean clinically relevant research, often from the basic sciences of medicine. I'm just putting this in here to show that you really need to remember that it's not simply the clinical aspect that is the external evidence. It is also the preclinical, the basic sciences of medicine, are also very important when we think about evidence-based medicine and how we move forward. So this is another type of pyramid of thinking about how evidence works. And I think Dr. Linares showed one similar to this. This is where systematic reviews are often placed at the top. And the reason for this is because if you look carefully at this particular diagram, you'll see the top three levels of the pyramid are filtered information. So these are summaries of primary studies, whereas the bottom three, minus the green at the bottom there, they're the unfiltered primary studies. So these are the individual studies which haven't been synthesized together. And at the very bottom, of course, we have background information or expert opinion. But when we start thinking about preclinical, we start having to ask questions about where do systematic reviews of in vivo animal studies, where do they fit in with this sort of traditional evidence-based preclinical medicine pyramid, and where do individual animal studies fall in? Do they simply fall in with the randomized control trials or cohort studies somewhere in there, or do they fall outside of that because they're not being used with humans? I think Dr. Linares in the first webinar showed them below expert opinion is where animal studies were. But you need to think about that they may not simply fit within the same pyramid. They might actually fall, for instance, without that pyramid or within another pyramid separate from the human research modus operandi. So just an example of a different way to think about this. If we look at Yannicka Horn's systematic review, in 2000 she did a Cochrane systematic review of calcium antagonists for acute ischemic stroke. And so here you have at the top of the pyramid a Cochrane systematic review done in humans. But they also in 2001 did a systematic review of the animal models for this calcium antagonist. So they're completely separate. The accumulation, synthesis, and summary of the knowledge, they aren't actually within the same pyramid, but they're actually used when we move forward from this. They're actually used in ways where this makes a lot of sense. The challenge that Yannicka Horn and her colleagues found was when looking at the systematic review, the preclinical, was that initially what was happening was that clinical trials were referring in the introduction to a single positive animal experiment to the proven effectiveness. They weren't using a systematic review, so it's of the preclinical animal models. So the problem isn't so much about how can we fit preclinical systematic reviews within the knowledge pyramid of the human research. The systematic review or the preclinical can completely be separate and still be a very effective tool for informing whether or not research should move forward. In fact, in the recent Lancet series on waste, this particular research was referenced by Ian Chalmers and colleagues, and they said that patients are enrolled into clinical trials that do not need to be done. The more than 7,000 individuals who had had a stroke would not have been enrolled in the clinical trials for the calcium antagonist because systematic reviews of the effects of the drugs in animal studies of stroke did not identify the protective effects. So here we clearly see that the systematic review itself of the preclinical has value in and of itself, and it's an important value that maybe shouldn't be simply placed at the bottom below expert opinion in the traditional knowledge pyramid. In fact, it has a really important value too, even when we think about it, not just from the perspective of translating into the early clinical trials of humans, but also to inform back to the community researchers who are doing the animal research. I love this quote. This is an excellent article from O'Collins and colleagues. And the quote is, a common perception of neuroprotection research is that everything works in animals but nothing works in people. You don't have to be a bench scientist long to have heard similar quotes along this in a number of areas. And I think what the preclinical systematic review has been showing is that there's actually sometimes a common perception that things are working in the animals when in fact they're not. And that's what the systematic reviews show, and they have that value in and to themselves, not just for the translation, but also to inform the animal researchers in the preclinical world. So what should be transferred? The brief argument I'm making, I think other people have made this argument elsewhere better, is that the basic unit for translation should be usually up-to-date systematic reviews or syntheses of the preclinical research animal findings. This lines up exactly with what goes on in the clinical world, is that the basic unit of knowledge arguably is the systematic review. And I think we should be moving towards the same idea. Now, oh, it's a little cut off on my screen, but that's okay. The question then is to whom should this knowledge be transferred? If the systematic review is the basic unit of translation, who are the knowledge users? Who does it get translated to? So this is again from Grimshaw and colleagues from their work. And you look at the different stakeholders for different types of research. So across the top here we have the potential stakeholders and the basic sciences, clinical, health services, and population health are the research. And then down the column we have the different stakeholders. You have consumers, professionals, local administrators, national policymakers, regulatory bodies, industry, research funders, and of course researchers themselves. And you can see that with basic science, consumers, professionals, local administrators, and national policymakers are generally considered to be less interested or not interested in the basic science findings themselves. Whereas regulatory bodies, industry, research funders, and certainly researchers have a very strong interest in looking at this research. It's of a high relevance to what they do. So I just want to go through a few examples to maybe make this a little more concrete. So when we think of a regulator, you might think of Health Canada or the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. You can also think of regulators as oversight. This would be research ethics boards. So at least in Canada, research ethics boards and the animal care committees, which are also known maybe as IACUCs down in the U.S. They don't necessarily have regulatory authority, so they're more of use more policy mechanisms, so they're more of an oversight agency. But these would be examples of the regulators. And when you look at what a regulator like Health Canada wants from non-clinical studies, in this case non-clinical is synonymous really with preclinical studies, is that they'll look at good clinical practice, section 7.3.5, and they're looking to actually get the results of all relevant non-clinical pharmacology, toxicology, pharmacokinetic, and investigational product metabolism studies should be provided in a summary form. This section is obviously much longer than the code I have here, but the regulators are already collecting and synthesizing this information from industry or academics who are running trials. They already do this, and they already collect and summarize the information from preclinical. It's important to them. Now, they aren't necessarily looking at systematic reviews, though. Same with research ethics boards in Canada. The QCPS2, that's the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2. In the section on clinical trials, research ethics boards have the responsibility to present the proposed research in the context of a systematic review. This clinical trial should not be conducted unnecessarily on questions that have already been definitively answered. But REBs also do have the same responsibility in the same section, and I've highlighted it in bold here, should carefully evaluate previous laboratory, animal, and human research with the drug or therapy, etc. So the research ethics boards, once again, as a regulator, a regulatory type body, they are charged with reviewing and seeing that the premise of the research is well situated. In the case of clinical, the human research, it's already in there to look at it and look at it using a systematic review. But with animal research, it's unclear as to what constitutes an adequate review. Perhaps the investigators for sure, but it's certainly not a systematic review as utilized as the basic unit of translation for a research ethics board. So obviously, the industry, this could be pharmaceuticals or biotech companies, funders. You may think of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the National Institutes of Health in the U.S., etc. And researchers might, in the examples I'm giving, which are very focused in the clinical world, might be preclinical or clinical researchers, maybe on either side, or they may actually work in both areas. So I'm just going to give, for the sake of time, just skip some of the industry and go right into the funders. If you look at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Canadian Institutes of Health Research already require a systematic review of the clinical. They want you to give a reference to any relevant systematic reviews and discuss the need for your trial in light of these reviews. And if you believe that there is no relevant previous trials, you need to demonstrate your search strategy. So once again, the funder here already value systematic reviews for the clinical area, but clinical systematic reviews, not necessarily preclinical systematic reviews. And here's an example. This is from an editorial from Collins and Tabak here, which was recently in Nature, and they discussed one of the initiatives going on at the NIH that they're working on to improve reproducibility, which I'll talk about a little bit later again. And that's to assess the value of assigning at least one reviewer of each panel to a specific task of evaluating the scientific premise of the grant application. And they want you to look at the key publications on which the application is based. And this is specifically and particularly important when a potentially costly human clinical trial is proposed based on animal model results. So this sounds very good, but once again, it's they're not talking about a systematic review here. In fact, what this sounds like they're talking about is a narrative review or an expert opinion, as opposed to a more methodological approach, like I'm definitely promoting in this talk. And you can think about the last case is different researchers from different disciplines. This is from Avey, another excellent paper. And when you look at the differences between animal preclinical studies and clinical studies, you can just look in this table. Down the left, you have things like centers, dose responses, and time responses. And then in the middle column, the animal preclinical studies. In the final column, the clinical trials, in this case, phase 2B and 3 trials. And you can look at some of the differences between them. In the first block, you see dose response and timing response. So in time response, it's variable. In the preclinical, most studies assess early administration. In clinical, it's uncommon. In fact, you can see that there's a lot of differences between these worlds. And this can be why it's important when you're thinking about who the knowledge users are, when you're doing your systematic review, is to make sure that you're thinking about that there might be people in the clinical world who need to read your systematic review. And then the differences between these worlds need to be taken into account. So who should it be transferred to? Obviously, as I said, regulators, industry, funders, and researchers. All of these groups already synthesize and or evaluate preclinical information. In fact, it's either part of the regulatory or policy requirement in many cases that the regulators impose, as well as that industry and researchers have to adhere to. However, systematic reviews themselves as the basic unit of translation, it's a different method of synthesis than is what is currently sort of the standard, whether it's the de facto standard or the standard in the actual policy documents. Another thing that's important to think about is that the systematic reviews may not be the end product that's the correct product to give to these knowledge users. In the case of, think of a research ethics board, is the correct product to give to a research ethics board the actual systematic review versus maybe a summary or some other form downstream of the systematic review for them to utilize in their decision-making process. So two of the big groups that are producing systematic reviews are, of course, Camarades and Circle. And these are groups which are definitely focused doing sort of preclinical systematic reviews, and we've already named. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. If you want to learn more about it, I recommend watching the webinar from Dr. Marlies Leonards in the first of the series here. But I did want to say that there are actually many other groups doing this work in preclinical in different areas. I think that it's important to remember that even though I'm talking about this often in the context of preclinical to clinical, for instance, if you look at the Center for Public Health and Zoonoses at the University of Guelph, just a few hours south of here, Dr. Jan Sargent has been really progressive in conducting systematic reviews in food safety and zoonoses. And you can think of a large government organization, the European Food Safety Authority, has been looking at how to incorporate systematic reviews and utilize them in food safety over in Europe. And of course, there's the evidence-based toxicology collaboration, which is an international collaboration looking at how to utilize systematic review methodology in toxicology, and the National Toxicology Program in the U.S. as well. If you go and look at their website, they're also looking at it and involved with utilizing systematic reviews. So there's many others. I'm not going to cover all the particular knowledge user today. I'm speaking at a very sort of 10-mile high level, but if you're in a particular area and you're thinking about doing this systematic reviews, you really want to think about within your scope of practice and within your domain, who are the knowledge users, where is this knowledge going to go, and identify those people as early as you can in the process. So just sort of recap what I've covered so far, what should be transferred, systematic reviews is the basic unit, and to whom it should be transferred. Regulatory bodies, industry funders, and researchers are obviously the sort of key players who are the key knowledge users. But these are not specific examples. It really depends on the particular domain, which any particular researcher would know better depending on where you're working on. But the national funders and national regulatories, etc., because they cover such a wide swath as well as such important steps in the process of funding and protecting the public in the research process, that there are obviously targets that need to be thought about in terms of knowledge use. So I just want to shift gears a little bit because I did say in the bio that I wrote up for this that I talk a little bit about sort of how we should think about preclinical systematic reviews fitting into the knowledge management system. And so I'm going to try and answer the question at least tentatively, where do preclinical systematic reviews fit from bench to bedside? And I'm going to do this in the context of NIH's recent editorial that Collins and Tabak put out. Francis S. Collins is the director of the NIH, and Ron C. Tabak is the principal deputy. The NIH spends about $30 billion a year on health research in the U.S. It's an incredibly important organization. It's really an important number of initiatives that came out in this editorial. Now, the editorial's cited as being about reproducibility, and I'm just going to go a little bit into it just to give a bit of a background about why this is so important. So first, they're concerned about irreproducibility in preclinical, and they list a number of problems such as poor training of researchers in experimental design, the provocative statements over technical details in publications, crucial elements of experimental design are simply ignored, secret sauce, that's probably my favorite example they list, and it's just the idea that researchers are intentionally withholding important methodological aspects of their papers so that way they have a competitive advantage. And then, of course, a well-known poor reporting of basic experimental design, such as blinding, randomization, and sample size calculations. So they're taking a number of initiatives, and these ones are near and dear to me. Testing the use of checklists to ensure a more systematic evaluation of grant application. Reviewers are reminded to check, for example, that appropriate experimental design features have been addressed, such as an analytical plan, transfer randomization, blinding, and so on. But as I said just earlier, this is the same quote, they're also looking at what is the scientific premise, and they're looking at how to assign, in this case, an individual or multiple people to look at that. This is really an area where potentially systematic reviews would have a huge potential for improving decisions moving forward and looking at the scientific premise. Now, although all these initiatives are sort of geared towards the idea of reproducibility, which is an important aspect, the reason that we're concerned about reproducibility really is knowledge translation. We're really concerned about making sure we can move from preclinical to clinical with a certain success rate. Reproducibility is a great goal in itself for us as researchers. Certainly is important for me as a bench scientist. But as we move forward, we're thinking about the importance of actually taking our discoveries at the preclinical stage and translating them to the clinic successfully. And reproducibility is part of that. So knowledge translation, just for those who aren't experts in it, I don't consider myself to be an expert in it, although I am a KT fellow. A dynamic and iterative process that includes synthesis, dissemination, exchange, and ethically sound application of knowledge to improve health, provide more effective health services and products, and strengthen the healthcare system. This is a definition from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So even when I read this definition of it, I often feel that this doesn't quite capture what we're doing when we move from preclinical to clinical necessarily. It has a bit of a feel that it's focused a little bit more on moving from the clinic to the bedside. But we can think about certainly knowledge translation and the key points of it, and we can think about it and apply it to the preclinical area. These sort of standard points are making users aware of knowledge. Are clinical trialists aware of preclinical systematic reviews? This is a really basic question. I know in the clinical epidemiology program here at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, I work with clinicians as well as preclinical scientists, and just making people aware that using systematic reviews for the preclinical information is a tool that's available. It is something that's important to do, because not everyone, and probably not the majority of people conducting clinical trials, are aware that this is an option. Facilitating the use of the knowledge. So how should systematic reviews be presented, as I said, for instance, a research ethics board? If you discuss with research ethics board's members, they might really like the idea, for instance, of having a systematic review being part of the review process, but research ethics board's members are incredibly swamped with a huge workload of reviewing protocols, and whether or not they even have the expertise to read this systematic review and interpret it in the context are important questions. So a systematic review itself may not be the right tool to translate the knowledge. There may need to be some summary or some other downstream product. Same with moving knowledge into action. One of the key things is to simply get out there and start conducting the preclinical systematic reviews. And that's the same idea for closing the gap between what we know and what we do as well. And an important thing to remember too when we're moving from preclinical to clinical is integrated knowledge translation. And this is where knowledge users and researchers work together, shape research questions, interpret study findings, and move research results into practice. And this makes a lot of sense, especially the last point, when we think about how are we moving research results into practice. And the example I gave at the very start with Annika Horn's work, the preclinical systematic review was unfortunately done after the clinical systematic review. And it was done long after many of the clinical trials had actually been conducted. We need to be doing the preclinical systematic reviews before we do the clinical systematic review and before we do the clinical trials. So we really need to be moving this up in time, and we need to work with the clinicians who are developing the clinical trials as well as with the people doing the preclinical systematic reviews to make sure that they're answering the right questions and getting the right data out of the preclinical that will best inform the actual clinical trial as we move forward. So when you think about this now in terms of models, knowledge translation, there's no shortage of models out there to look at. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of them before I try to sort of wedge what I think is a good spot for the systematic reviews to fit in. This one is from recent colleagues in 2008, actually, and these are the valleys of death. I hope someone's smiling at that title. But as we move from basic biomedical research, we go through Valley 1, the first valley of death, before we get to the clinical science and knowledge. And then, of course, there's another valley of death, the clinical practice and health decision making. And Valley 2 is really where a lot of the KT science has been focused. But there's definitely more attention now being focused, I think, on Valley 1 with the problems with reproducibility and on all the issues that are coming from doing systematic reviews and evaluating the reporting quality in the preclinical. And this is the valley that we're interested in. We're interested in Valley 1. This is the same idea. It's a different conceptualization. It's a little bit more complicated, but we go all the way from T0 to T4. People may be more familiar with using the T's to describe the gaps between the different stages of research. So with T0, we go with scientific discovery research, and that's then translated to T1, translational research from discovery to candidate application. So we're interested really in sort of the scientific discovery, T1 candidate application. That's really the area that we're focused on when we're talking about preclinical systematic reviews. And that's the area that we need to sort of expand on and look at in more detail. And a great way to look at that in more detail is this wonderful article by Westphal and colleagues called Practice-Based Research, the Blue Highways on the NIH Roadmap. And aside from the red box that I've added just to highlight where we're looking, I'll go through the roadmap. Is that it starts at the bench with basic science, and we have our preclinical animal studies in the box at the top left. And then T1 research, this is our phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, and this is translation to humans. And then this moves more to bedside with human clinical research with our controlled observational studies and phase 3 clinical trials. T2 then translates this into clinical practice, right? And this is where we're delivering the recommended care to the right patient at the right time. Well, not me, I'm not a medical doctor, but identification of new clinical questions and gaps in care. And so in this particular article, they were really expanding on what's T2 and talking about doing practice-based research. And when you look at what they've expanded at the bottom of the graph here, they have T2, which is guidelines, development, meta-analysis, and systematic reviews, sort of occurring underneath the bedside box with translation to patients. And of course, under T2, they have the phase 3 and 4 clinical trials, observational studies, and survey research. And T3 is really the dissemination research and implementation research that translates those findings into practice. Now, our interest is really back here at the top left in the red box. Here, and this is what we need to think about when we're translating the research to the knowledge users from systematic reviews, from the basic science research preclinical into T1. But this is a fairly tight box, and this is often in these models when you look at this is the way it's described. Preclinical is simply one box, and then it goes right to phase 1. So I want to expand the preclinical, and there's fortunately very recently Jonathan Kimmelman and his colleagues published a great paper which allows us to sort of think about the basic science and expand it out. And the basic premise that they talked about was the difference between exploratory and confirmatory research at the basic science level. So exploratory research was essentially developing the pathological theories or mechanisms of a drug's actions, and you could compare this with confirmatory research, where we're rigorously testing the drug's clinical potential and restricting the advance of ineffective interventions being advanced into clinical testing. So in the preclinical area, we definitely have lots of exploratory research. I definitely did myself as a bench scientist I did more exploratory research. Whereas confirmatory research looks much more similar to what you would find in a clinical trial, and it's really the translational research that we use to move from preclinical to clinical research. So that already lets us expand that box of basic science and start to tease it apart and understand where systematic reviews are going to fit in. Now, another sort of caveat to remember when I'm talking moving over is there's this perceived need when you start talking about knowledge translation, is that everything needs to be translated, and we need to spend money translating every finding that we got, and every researcher and every lab needs to have a knowledge translation strategy. And I just want to back off before I go any further and just say that that's not what I'm promoting. I don't think that's what CAHR and many of these people in the knowledge translation world are promoting. In fact, it goes against what they're saying. This point here, this quote, results from a single research study should be contextualized within the synthesis of the global research results before extraordinary dissemination and implementation efforts are undertaken. And this ties back into what I said. Really, systematic reviews are the basic unit of knowledge translation. We're not talking about finding one study where endostands look like they're good for curing cancer in rats, and then immediately running with a massive knowledge translation strategy to implement that in clinical trials. We need multiple studies that confirm it, understand the pathophysiology, et cetera, and synthesize that information before we go forward. So, what might this look like? This is my attempt that I've been working on with some people to try and break apart the preclinical translation and understand where systematic reviews are going to fit in to improving the translation. So I'll just walk you through it. At the bench level, we split bench research into Jonathan Kimmelman's exploratory research here, as well as basic research here. And we have preclinical translation exploratory sort of in between them. And I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to focus on the PTC here, the preclinical translation confirmatory. And if we expand it along the similar way that Westphal and colleagues did with T2 to translate, in this case we're translating the T1 to the phase 1, is that we look that the translation to humans, I think, actually is starting much earlier in the knowledge system. Translation to humans doesn't just start over here at T1. Translation to humans is starting at the confirmatory stage here, because we need to be thinking about and designing our confirmatory bench studies, thinking about what the clinical trials are going to look like. And this is where guidelines development, meta-analysis, and systematic reviews will help us to translate to humans as well as translating to other animal models. So systematic reviews, of course, allow us to evaluate multiple models as well as multiple species and their effectiveness. So this would be sort of the preclinical translation 1. Now the type of translation-based research, the one that's being promoted the most, at least anecdotally from what I've seen, are these ideas of multi-center preclinical or phase 3 preclinical trials, but as well as doing secondary research within this translation step, systematic reviews and meta-analysis as an important part of the research tool for moving into T1. And then similar to our dissemination and implementation research, when we're moving research into practice, so at moving it from bedside research in late phase clinical trials, but to actually practice with doctors, we do need to do dissemination and implementation research for moving research from the bench at this confirmatory stage into the clinical trials. We can't ignore this topic area and just assume that it's going to happen without putting some effort and resources into understanding the processes and how these things actually work. So finally, just to review, preclinical translation at the confirmatory stage, you can think of this as guidelines, for instance, the STAIR recommendations for stroke, and of course systematic reviews and meta-analyses, efficacy and safety reviews, and maybe even etiology reviews in some cases, just as a few examples. And at the dissemination stage, right, these are the questions that I've really been trying to touch upon earlier in the talk, is do the systematic reviews reach the right knowledge users? Are the traditional publications versus other formats the right tools for disseminating the information? And implementation, how is preclinical animal research actually being utilized by the decision makers at regulators and research ethics boards? We don't necessarily have actually very good information on this, and how is efficacy and safety weighted in the decision-making process? That might impact how we're actually looking at conducting and analyzing the information in systematic reviews, and certainly in how we're presenting it to these groups. So where do preclinical systematic reviews fit from bench to bedside? They're definitely part of T1, but they're within the bench side. They start at the confirmatory stage, I think, certainly. Maybe they even started the exploratory stage. I didn't touch upon that today. Certainly lots of people have opinions on that matter. But they're definitely, for moving information from preclinical to T1, I think it's fair to say that systematic reviews definitely play a role within the confirmatory sphere. So to sum up, the basic unit of preclinical translation really should be systematic reviews, maybe other forms of synthesis as well. And then the key knowledge users are really going to be regulators, industry funders, and other researchers who need the information to do the translation. We need to integrate all of these users into the research and research questions in meaningful ways. And we need to promote the adoption of systematic reviews as a tool. It's really important for practicing evidence-based medicine to continually promote the adoption of the best tools, and it's something that preclinical systematic reviewers we need to continue doing as well. And it's for knowledge translation and sort of where does it fit in the knowledge management system, as I just argued, preclinical systematic reviews are really at the T1 and at the bench. Because at the T1 stage, if you're a research ethics board, a human research ethics board, looking at whether or not a trial goes forward, you need to look at the preclinical basis of it, and you need to look at it with the same seriousness that you do at the human clinical. And at the bench stage, if you're an animal care committee, you also need to be looking at the preclinical work that's being presented to you, for instance, with the same sort of seriousness that you would, I think, the clinical work that the way an REB would. So it's really a sort of an expansion of the bench portion of knowledge translation, and by expanding that and looking at it in more detail, I think it helps us see where systematic reviews fit in the knowledge translation process. And so that's everything. Mercifully, I'm done. I'd just like to thank the Alberta Hospital Research Institute and the Canadian Institute of Health Research for supporting me, and my advisors, Dr. David Moore and Julie Griffin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marc. That was fantastic. If we can just send Marc another round of applause by clicking on the emoticon, that would be fantastic. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat room. I have gone ahead and sent you over the evaluation link. If you can just take a moment and please fill that evaluation out, that would be fantastic. It does help us reassure that we are meeting our needs with the evaluations, and lets us know how we are doing. So while we wait to see if any questions come through, I'd also like to let you know about our impact stories. We want to hear about you and how you used Cochrane evidence to make your healthcare decisions. Submit your Cochrane story for a chance to win an iPad or an Amazon gift card worth $500 or $250. And every submission also does get a $5 Starbucks coupon. Please visit our site for more details on that. Marc, we do have one question here for you. Is there one place stop to find systematic reviews of animal studies, such as the Cochrane Library? What do you recommend?
Hi, thank you, Karen, for the question. It's actually a very good question. Let me give a few points on that. There's no one-stop place currently. There's definitely a new journal that's recently come out, and take this with a grain of salt, because I'm on the editorial board, evidence-based preclinical medicine, started by Dr. David Howells and Dr. Malcolm McLeod, which will be accepting preclinical systematic reviews from a variety of areas, environmental toxicology, you name it, obviously preclinical drug, biologics, etc. So that'll hopefully become a very good source for finding them, but it's not a one-stop source for finding them. One thing that we're working on, certainly myself at the Alberta Hospital Research Institute with my colleagues at Circle and Camarades, I was looking at how we can sort of emulate Prospero. Prospero is a systematic review registry where you can go in, you spend about an hour, and you pre-register your clinical systematic review before you conduct it, which makes it a very useful spot to go and stop and actually search to see whether or not there's a systematic review being proposed or being done as sort of a one-stop place to find them. And so one thing that we're definitely working on is actually getting up and running a similar registry where people have the option to come and pre-register preclinical studies. Prospero is currently limited to human use. It is to clinical studies, and what we're looking at, we're in discussion with them currently to see about expanding that mandate to preclinical, because there are going to be there would definitely need to be changes that would have to occur for what is registered.
Excellent, thank you. Once again, I'd like to thank you for coming out to today's webinar, and I'd like to send another big thank you to Marc, our presenter for today, on a very successful webinar. Now please visit our site for some updates on upcoming training and events that will be happening with Cochrane soon. Thank you, and I wish you all a great day.